Hello my friends, I have made a lot of videos about the Sony A7 III over the years, but in this video we will take a look at it from a different perspective. The A7 III has moved down in the hierarchy after the launch of the A7 IV and it basically became Sony's entry-level full-frame camera. In this video we will take a look at how the A7 III performs in this new role and whether it is still worth buying in 2022. As I've explained in my previous videos, I think that there are 6 components that make up a complete modern hybrid camera. Those are the sensor and the output, the autofocus, video specs, in-body image stabilization, battery life, and compact packaging. The A7 III had and still has some huge advantages, some of its aspects might have been average, but it didn't really have any major weaknesses by 2018 standards. My A7 III is now 4 years old, but it looks pretty good in my opinion. The most significant damage is the worn-off paint near the A7 III logo caused by an early prototype cage. The weather sealing was one of the questionable parts of the A7 III, but mine has managed to survive a reasonable amount of the rain over the years without damage. One thing that I still greatly appreciate about the A7 III is the size. Newer Sony A7 cameras are still very compact, but the size difference between the A7 III and A7 IV is actually noticeable. I really like to use it as a holiday walk-around camera with small prime lenses, such as my favorite Samyang AF 35mm f1.8 or even Sony 28mm f2. The A7 III is significantly smaller than the Z6 II or the S1. It is roughly as big as the S5. One area where the A7 III does not lag behind the latest hybrid cameras is the sensor performance. It was the first camera with IMX410 sensor, which has been later used in Z6, Z6 II, S1, S5 and so on. It is a 24 megapixel sensor with backside illumination. 24 megapixels is in my opinion the minimum for all-round use in 2022, but it is still sufficient for the vast majority of digital publishing and even for pretty large prints. Regarding the ISO performance, no full-frame camera that I've ever tested was able to beat the A7 III. The noise level is basically the same with every IMX410 camera except the original Z6, which has serious bending issues. Newer Sony cameras with high-resolution sensor, such as the A7 IV or A7R IV, will also show very similar amount of noise after the downsampling. That basically means that you are still getting class-leading low-light performance with the A7 III. Exactly the same applies to the dynamic range. I still remember how amazed I was by the shadow recovery capabilities of the A7 III back in 2018. As long as you stay in the lower ISO values, you can use the full range of the highlights and shadow sliders and you will hardly see any noise at all. Full-frame cameras with Sony sensors released after the A7 III can again match it, but there isn't really any full-frame camera that can beat the A7 III when it comes to the dynamic range. I think that a good sensor is the key component of a camera in the long term. Even if the full-frame camera gets a bit outdated, it will still be able to give you that rich full-frame look, shallow depth of field, low light performance, and if it has Sony sensor, very decent dynamic range. Even something like a Nikon D750 introduced in 2014 can still take excellent stills. It is customary to say that the colors were improved with every new Sony camera, but the truth is that the main improvement has happened with the introduction of A7 III, so the colors are not that different. The white balance is a little bit different in some scenes. Sony aims for maximal accuracy and that is basically what you will get. Regarding the autofocus, it is still very capable even by 2022 standards. It is still very fast, responsive and reliable. The new system in A7 IV is even more fluid and responsive, but the A7 III will absolutely get the job done. It is still better than the autofocus in newest Fujifilm cameras, and it clearly outperformed the Nikon Z6 II in my standard testing. Pure performance of single point or extended spot focusing isn't that different in comparison to newer Sony cameras. The main area where the A7 III autofocus lags behind the newest Sony cameras are the advanced features. A7 IV offers real-time tracking in both stills and video. It works with humans and also with animals. It also works incredibly well. A7 III only offers real-time eye autofocus in stills, but it also works great. A big difference is that the A7 IV has a normal touch tracking where you can just tap on the screen and it will track the subject. A7 III only has center lock on AF, which is very cumbersome, slow to set up, and not very reliable. A7 III has 3 speed settings and 2 responsiveness settings. These make a huge difference and they can completely change the behavior of the autofocus system, so I highly recommend trying these out. Newer Sony cameras such as A7 IV offer more options in terms of the speed and responsiveness, but the A7 III settings were always sufficient for me personally. The video specs were adequate for 2018 high-end hybrid full-frame camera, and I think that they are also very appropriate for 2022 entry-level full-frame. It can shoot fully downsampled 6K to 4K video in 24 and 25p with no crop. There is a moderate crop in 30p. The level of detail is still among the best cameras on the market. Basically, the only camera that can be the A7 III in terms of the detail is the A7 IV with downsampled 7K to 4K. The A7 III can also shoot 120 frames per second in 1080p. The image quality is very decent if you set the sharpening correctly, and I wouldn't hesitate to mix it with 4K footage if needed. There is no 4K 60p, which is to be expected. The A7 III also has a low-pass filter, which gives the video a little bit more natural look. The video is 8-bit only. Some of the commentators describe 8-bit video as useless, which is a complete nonsense, of course. It is sufficient basically for any kind of SDR publishing. Most users still publish video out of the camera, and the A7 III is more than adequate for that. If you want decent flexibility for color grading, Picture Profile 8 with Gamma Change to Cine 4 is a great option, as I have described in my previous videos about the A7 III. If you want to shoot the S-Log, A7 III is simply not for you. You will have to get the A7 IV or A7S III. The same applies if you want to shoot clips longer than 30 minutes, which is the recording limit of A7 III. The A7 III has a 5-stop in-body image stabilization. That is an achievement by itself considering the body size. The effectiveness of the in-body image stabilization is pretty solid. It is a bit less effective than the in-body image stabilization in A7 IV, but it is still sufficient for static shots and pointing the camera around. Importantly, it helps a lot with the smoothness of the footage when you are using a gimbal. The behavior of the IBIS is very predictable, so there are no sudden snaps or anything like that. Regarding the handling, the A7 III was basically the first camera to use Sony's new control layout, which is still being used on the latest Sony cameras. I think that this control layout is very logical. All of the buttons and dials are very well placed and easy to reach. A7 III offers 3 command dials, 12 customizable buttons, exposure compensation dial, joystick, and so on. Basically, the only 2 changes regarding the handling that were introduced with the newer cameras are larger grip and raised buttons. I do prefer the larger grip on the A7 IV in terms of the ergonomy, but the smaller grip on the A7 III is in my opinion not bad at all, and it contributes to the smaller size, so I appreciate that as well. One thing that I miss a lot on the A7 III in comparison with A7 IV is the stills and video switch, which is extremely convenient. Other than that, I can still say that I am very happy with the handling of the A7 III. Now we are getting to some aspects of the A7 III that are a bit outdated. The first thing that comes to mind is the menu system. The main menu uses a horizontal layout which is somewhat logically organized, but it has almost no structure or categorization. I actually haven't found it to be that big of an issue in practical use. The A7 III doesn't have as many features and settings as the A7 IV, for example, so I was able to accommodate all of the necessary items in my menu tab. I haven't really used the rest of the main menu for about 3 years. The function menu is fortunately very good, which helps a lot. Another outdated part of the A7 III is the display. It uses a 3-inch panel with 921,000 dots, which is pretty low resolution. Probably the only positive of this panel is the brightness, which is sufficient with sunny weather setting. The display doesn't necessarily limit the usage of the camera, but it does decrease the overall experience. Fortunately, it uses a tilting screen mechanism. As you might know, I am not a fan of rotating screens at all, so that is actually an advantage of the A7 III in comparison to A7 IV for me personally. The electronic viewfinder is in my opinion slightly better than the display, but still not great. It has about 2.3 million dots resolution. Again, it is fine to use, but not particularly pleasant to use. The A7 III can shoot 10 frames per second with autofocus continuous and mechanical shutter in full 14-bit RAW. That is actually more than the A7 IV, although that one shoots larger 33 megapixel stills. The buffer capacity is about 42 RAWs, which is pretty solid. That makes the A7 III a very solid fast action camera within the category. It has 2 SD card slots, but only one of them is UHS 2 compatible. That means that you can have simultaneous recording to both cards, but not at full UHS 2 speed. The battery life is a huge strength of the A7 III. It is rated for 710 shots, but you can realistically get well over 1000 shots depending on the usage. You can also get 3 hours of 4K video. The A7 III destroys all other cameras in the category in this regard. For example, the battery life is at least 40% better than with the Z6 II. Probably the biggest strength of the A7 III in 2022 is simply that it is an E-mount camera. One particular lens that gave the A7 III a huge popularity boost was Tamron 28-75mm f2.8 Di3RXD. Now we have the Di3VXD G2 version of this lens, which is an upgrade of the original 28-75. You can get basically any lens for the E-mount, including specialties such as 12-24mm f2.8. There is a lot of budget-friendly options from third-party manufacturers such as Viltrox 24mm f1.8 or Samyang AF 35mm f1.8 FE. My favorite lenses are small wide-angle primes. Sony FE 20mm f1.8G and 24mm f1.4GM are the two best that I've ever used, so I'm very happy in this regard. The other important part of the ecosystem are the other cameras. There is already a lot of E-mount cameras that you can eventually upgrade to or switch to from A7 III. The A7 IV is a direct upgrade with significant improvements in almost every way. If you want something very portable for traveling, there is the A7C. If you decide to become an advanced filmmaker, there is the A7S III, FX3 or even FX6. If you need more resolution for commercial use, there is the A7R4A. The A7 III also has one significant weakness in the entry-level market, which is the price. The A7 III is more expensive than Canon EOS RP or Nikon Z5, but those cameras have significant feature set limitations such as old non-BSI sensor, cropped 4K video and so on. The A7 III is kind of in the upper entry-level class together with Nikon Z6 II and Panasonic S5. Nikon Z6 II has some advantages over the A7 III such as the display and the electronic viewfinder, but the autofocus is still not on Sony level and the handling is not that great as I have explained in my comparison, which will be linked in the description. Panasonic S5 has fantastic video specs, but the autofocus is in my opinion unacceptable by 2022 standards. It is a better choice for advanced filmmakers, but everybody else will benefit from much superior autofocus more. The biggest reason to get the A7 III over the Z6 II and S5 is the E-mount ecosystem. You will basically get the extra cost of the A7 III back simply by buying third-party standard zoom. To sum up, the A7 III is a very solid upper entry-level full-frame camera in 2022. First of all, it just takes very nice stills and video. It has great sensor, which is still unbeaten in terms of the ISO performance and the dynamic range. The autofocus is also excellent even by 2022 standards. It doesn't have the latest video features such as 4K 60p and 10-bit, but it is still a very capable camera for content creation or even some types of commercial use. The E-mount is the most complete system on the market and it is one of the main selling points of the A7 III. The only three things that show the age of the A7 III are the display, electronic viewfinder and the menu. If there was a Sony A7 IIIA with a new display, electronic viewfinder and menu system, it would be perfectly modern camera even by 2022 standards. Most importantly, it will still get a lot of the jobs done in 2022. I personally still use the A7 III and I will definitely continue using it for a foreseeable future. The A7 IV is naturally a better camera in almost every way, so it comes down to the price. If you need to save the money and you don't need advanced video features or high resolution, I can still recommend the A7 III in 2022 and beyond. So that's it for this video, thank you for watching, I hope that you liked this video and that you have found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share opinion, please do so in the comment section, and see you next time.